Well, hi, everyone. My name is Tina Barton, and I am a senior elections expert with the Elections Group. Thank you all for joining our final conversation in our Accelerating Excellence series. Today, we'll be discussing Florida's Certified Election Professional Program. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that the Q&A feature should be on for participants to ask questions for our experts to answer during the Q&A section of today's presentation. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's session. The Elections Group is an elections consulting partnership founded by former election officials Jennifer Morell and Noah Prates. We partner with state and local election officials to implement new programs or improve processes for voters and stakeholders. We provide guidance, resources, and direct management support for jurisdictions. Our team is made up of all former election officials from across the United States. And speaking of election officials, I'm really excited to have with us today Marion County Supervisor of Elections, Wesley Wilcox, Leon County Supervisor of Elections, Mark Earley, and the Florida Supervisor of Elections consultant, Ann Schroeder, on today's webinar. So thank you to each of you for joining us today. I appreciate that. We just give a brief introduction of yourself, if you don't mind. I'm going to start with Ann. Tell us a little bit about who you are and your connection to the organization.
Thank you. As a former director of the Florida Institute of Government, I have a background in working with public sector and primarily for municipalities and counties throughout the state. And that's really how my organization, my name, was suggested to the Florida Supervisors of Elections because of that connection.
Great, thank you. Wesley?
Yes, Tina. As mentioned, I am the Supervisor of Elections in Marion County, Florida. Position I've held for about 11 years now. Prior to that, I was the Assistant Supervisor of Elections here in Marion County for a number of years, and that's when I actually began participating in the FCEP program.
Awesome. Mark?
Yeah, I'm the current Supervisor of Elections in Leon County, Florida. Like Wesley, I've got some positions on some boards at the federal level. Been working elections since '86. After the 2000 elections in Florida, which I was heavily involved in, I went and worked with a vendor for about 6.5 years, but been the elected supervisor since 2017 and love our association and the FCEP program. Very valuable.
Again, I'm super excited to have all of you here and just really appreciate your contributions to the profession and to your state and kind of the ripple effect that you're having across the country. So thank you for that. Today's conversation is going to be guided by the case study and implementation guides that were published by the Elections Group, both of which highlight the FCEP program. So you'll be able to find links to both of those documents in the chat if you're watching the webinar. So let's go back and let's start kind of at the beginning of all of this, right? Let's talk about the development of this program. And you all three of you have a deep history with the program and have seen it kind of go from just an idea to becoming something that's award-winning. So I'd like to know, what was the driver behind this? Like, what pushed you all to do this? How did the idea for the program come about? How did you fund it? Who is it ran by? But let's start with what was the driver. What pushed this?
And you want to take it for that, and then I'll come in?
Sure. I was contacted in 2006 following the 2005 strategic planning that was done by the association. And at that point, then Supervisor Jennifer Edwards from Collier County was the initial contact. And we had probably an hour-and-a-half conversation dealing with, these are the reasons we need to do this. Florida's in the spotlight. We'd like to become more professional, transparent, accurate, have everything that it takes to be sure that our staff are all fully trained. So with that genesis, it took 3 years from that phone call. I remember it being April, actually, before we did the pilot program in 2009, which was done at FGCU, which is the State University in Fort Myers. So that was the initial request. And during those 3 years, I had full support, which was wonderful, of the Education Committee to conduct some very in-depth research. And that included 2 focus groups, 2 online surveys, 30 one-on-one phone interviews, and then research across not only the state, but the country for who else was doing certification programs. And there's some obvious ones. It could be education, professional engineers, property appraisers, so that I had some notion of what the framework would look like.
So I heard you say the phrase Florida was in the spotlight. And that's really kind of what drove all this, right? I mean, election officials across the country are feeling the heat right now. And besides the fact that you're in Florida and it's hot all the time, Florida election officials have been feeling the heat for a long time, right? So this has gone beyond just the 2016, 2020 cycle for all of you. This goes back to like 2000, right? I mean, talk to me through that. Like, what was going on there? What happened? And why were you all going to Ann saying, we need something?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, you know, the spotlight was on us, especially since the year 2000. And we as an association decided, you know, not only with HAVA going into effect and all of the other things that were more stabilizing just kind of the industry, we needed something that brought the professionals up in the industry as well. You know, we kind of modeled a little bit off the election center's SARA program. A lot of us initially that were in the FCEP program also were in the SARA or were a SARA certified person as well. The challenge that we faced in Florida, you know, is we're extremely diverse. You know, we've got 67 counties. You know, we've got Miami-Dade that's 1.5 million. You know, we've got the Orange counties, a lot of counties, but we've also got a Lafayette County and a Glades County that are economically disadvantaged. They could never afford to go to an election center event. And so the challenge we were facing was, how are we going to raise the entire tide for all of us in the fiscal constraints that we had? And so that was part of the challenge. As Ann mentioned, Supervisor Edwards, also Supervisor Davis out of Martin County, they were very instrumental. I believe Vicki Davis out of Martin County is a former school board or in with the school system. So that was a big push from her perspective as well. And we just realized as a whole that we needed to do something. And so this was a great thing that they started, and that's kind of where we're at today.
And we knew we were only as strong as our weakest link, and everybody had to up their game, and the complexity was just getting to be overwhelming. So we needed a framework within which we could educate everyone and get them all up to par.
So who was
I think that's a really good point, that what was brought out, that there was more than one member on the Education Steering Committee that had an education background. Dr. Brenda Snipes was on there. Certainly Vicki Davis, as was mentioned, she was on the school board for Martin County. So there was already an understanding that education seemed to be an answer.
Yeah, I think that's great. And thank you, Ann. That was a question I was just getting ready to ask. So thank you for bringing that up. As you were looking at starting all of this, certainly you were considering lots of factors, but financing of getting something like this off the ground certainly had to be one of those things that you were looking at as how do we do this? So what was your answer for that?
We decided, you know, that we as an association felt so strongly about it and felt that it was so imperative that we do this. We actually, as an association, loaned the program a startup amount. I believe the original startup amount was around $90,000. I believe that that's accurate, and I'm not sure if you know. But I will tell you, after probably maybe the third or fourth year in existence, not only has this program paid that money back, they now have a several $100,000 surplus to where we're able to offer scholarships to our programs. If we have counties that are unable to at least foot the nominal fee that we charge, especially our economically disadvantaged, disadvantaged counties. So we offer scholarships out of this. It's been an extremely successful program, well beyond, I believe, any of the original founders' thought process.
And like you mentioned, you've kind of been engaged in this from the very beginning, right? So what is your continued role, as you were there from the start, but what is it that you continue to do for the organization? And tell me a little bit about that collaborative partnership that you have with them that really, I think, is a key to making this program so successful.
Sure. Yeah. In addition to developing the framework and the initial 30 courses, then my role, along with one other, we are co-coordinators, meaning we are responsible for all the content, making sure that it stays relevant and up to date. We are responsible for bringing in all the instructors. We both have strong backgrounds in instructional design as well as presentation skills, so we know what we're looking for. When we first developed it, I picked people who were content experts who could help with content. They were not necessarily the same people that might do the presentations, because you need to also have excellent platform skills to make that happen. So my role continues to be making sure that the curriculum aspects are taken care of. We have someone else who handles the administrative aspects, meaning the registration, getting people to pay, making sure that people have their confirmations and so on. Oh, and then part of my role as well with the other co-coordinator, Dr. Dina Hurst, is all of the materials. We feel very strongly that the materials have to be easy to read, up to date, excellent PowerPoints, good handouts, things that people can use as resources after the fact. So that anything to do with curriculum is what I manage, including the recertification classes. And we're now up to number 4 that will be held in October this year.
If I could, I'd jump in. I would say another thing that Ann brings to this is assuring that not only is the content relevant, but the quality is extremely high of the class curriculum. Maintaining that professional approach, professional quality classes that you might find in a university classroom environment. I think that goes a long way to generating the interest, because it's really relevant, but it's very good quality productions.
And I'll tag in just a moment as well and add that, as Ann mentioned, not only is it subject matter experts, but it's also people that can do a presentation as well. And as you can imagine, I was one of the first ones to do one of the technical programs. The technical program I did 12 years ago would not even be relevant today. And so they've replaced and updated those things, whether it be a tabulation system. One of our courses is tabulation. Obviously, that's changed in 12 years. So keeping that course content up to date and the look and feel of it. 12 years ago or 14 when we started this, Zoom was not a thing. And so being able to do these different platforms, which is one of the things we've started offering a little bit. But having these different platforms and having this content continually be up to date with a fresh look and feel, and also fresh perspectives. So, I mentioned I did a tech class 12 or 14 years ago. I am not the guy to do that in today's world. There are much more talented people to do that. And so keeping that instructor collaboration up to date is extremely imperative. And let me add one final thing. One of the final things that we do in each of our classes is we asked for a feedback from the participants in this, and I think it is extremely imperative to ensure that the instructors are up to the task, not only with a knowledge base, but also the presentation skills. As everybody knows, somebody may be really great at whatever this widget is, but if they can't tell you how to work that and how to do that, it's really not that great for a presentation.
Well, I can say I was certainly very impressed with the vetting of your classes, really how detailed you are about going about the process. You're checking all the presentations, your instructors. I honestly think it's probably one of the best models in the country for something that I have seen for associations like this. So I think, Anne, you're offering somewhere around 30 classes. Is there 30 classes total that are offered with some electives? Can you talk to me about the classes? Obviously, as you just mentioned, Wesley, they have certainly progressed. They have changed. Can you tell me about how that kind of has come about? Like what classes maybe you decided were most important in the beginning, and now you've moved to this set curriculum that you're using, and how do you determine electives, things like that, and when to change classes out?
Sure, there's a total of 30, and more than half are election oriented, whether it's registration, whether it's election law, audits and recounts, voting systems, all of those. And certainly after each time that the legislature has concluded, we find what laws need to be embedded, what do we need to change, how do we keep the information current, and know that sometimes it's a little bit of a moving target. And along with whatever's going on currently in the state, in the country, in the world, for the soft skills classes, we always make sure that the examples are election related and that certain events, or let's call them conversational topics to make it very relevant, are also included. So we look after every series of 5, we do them in blocks of 5. So let's say a typical year could be, this is pre-COVID, a typical year could be 5 classes, 4 different times. So that would be a total of 20 classes in one calendar year. And after each series, we would have the debriefing with the co-chairs. There's also an FCEP committee now that's a dedicated committee just for the FCEP program. The observers, such as myself, also are taking notes, meaning as the co-coordinators, we're looking to see, did that go the way we thought? Did the kinds of questions that people asked, did the activities work? All of that has to go together to make a class that, from our standpoint, it has to also be enjoyable. Mm-hmm. And we even say you might even have fun during some of the classes, because we like the engagement activities to be very effective. And then we take that to the steering committee. They look at all of the data, and then we decide, because initially we had 33 classes, and then there was a decision to combine 2 of them and to drop 2 of them. So meaning each time we do a really in-depth evaluation, it's always open for, let's call it kind of minor to major course corrections. And that's been probably the most major course correction, was to drop it to 30 classes. And we feel that it's better for the fact. So we're comfortable with how that's gone now.
So Anne, you just mentioned COVID, right? And you said that was pre-COVID. How did COVID impact your program, and what did you do to pivot? And are there changes that you implemented because of that you're going to keep, that you found, hey, this actually works better for us?
Absolutely. So when we knew that was happening, the other core coordinator and myself did a deep dive in research of what kind of virtual platforms were out there, and probably investigated 3 or 4 different delivery models, presented an in-depth proposal to the co-chairs and to the committee, and the decision was made to use Zoom, and it has worked flawlessly. And So one of the things that I know we sometimes have a little bit of a smile about is people actually said, and I'm paraphrasing, wow, we didn't think it would be this good. All the way from, gee, that wasn't too bad. And of course, we take both of those as high compliments. And of course, what it showed us is that this is a delivery model we can keep to some extent if we choose to, because as was pointed out so aptly by the two supervisors of elections, there's some counties that are so small, they can't send someone and still keep their office open. So being able to do this remotely has opened our eyes to that alternate delivery model. And it's worked well. We just have to modify what kind of engagement activities that can be done. But you know from using Zoom and that we're using it today, how many options you have to keep people engaged.
So what kind of qualifiers do you have for someone to get certified? Is it open to anybody, everybody? Do you have to be an election official? What are your requirements there? And why did you make some of those decisions?
We actually, it originally was open to just election officials, and I think there was some thought that it may only be open to supervisors. It was then decided for it to be the elected official as well as the staff, and that's how I was able to come in as a staff member. We have also now opened it up to our election vendors. And that was a fairly thoughtful conversation, and that, you know, our vendors are our partners, and a lot of the things that we learn and need to know as an elections office, they also need to know as well, and understand the complexities of the office as well as the holistic look of it. And that's the point of these classes, at least in my opinion, is to get a holistic look of an entire election environment, not just delve into a technical topic or a tabulation or some other voter registration or laws. It's the entire holistic look, the 30,000 foot level view. And so by including our vendors in there, that tells us a couple of things that ensures to us that they feel they're a partner, they are our partner, and their success and our success are intertwined. And so we open it to all three. Now, one change that we recently made, probably I guess about 3 years ago now, is the challenge that we were facing, and it's a wonderful challenge to face, I will tell you, is that the classes were so popular that the actual elected official, the person who signs the check that allows people to go, were getting locked out of the classes. Yeah. Registration would open at 8 o'clock, and if you don't know this about Florida, we're Eastern and Central time. Registration would open at 8 o'clock Eastern, and by about 8:15 Eastern, the classes were full at capacity. And so all the Central time zone people, especially the supervisors and anybody that wasn't just right on it, would get locked out of the classes. So we've gone to kind of a tiered invitation model that seems to be working very well, in that, you know, the invitation to sign up goes to supervisors first. And remember, there's only 67 of us, and I'm certified, so I'm not in that mix. So that pool constantly stays fairly small, but it's imperative that somebody new into this organization gets into this pipeline as soon as possible, learns the need for this. And plus, once they get in, hopefully they'll bring their team and their staff. After we do the supervisors for a few days, we open it up to staff members. And then once that's done, then we open it up to the vendors as well. So that's kind of our invitation model.
And in Florida, it's not just supervisors running elections. We have municipalities. So the officials that are responsible for municipal elections, maybe the city clerk, and I believe even, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe even the state officials, state level division of elections under Secretary of State can sign up for classes too. But yeah, it's all tiered. And us and Taylor Swift, it's a high demand.
Did I understand that you all are going to expand and maybe do some regional work because you have gotten so many people that are interested in this? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. I think Ann, am I hosting the first regional? I know I have one coming up in August. It may not be the
Yes.
first. Yeah. And I won't even be here. I'll be out in Salt Lake City for an event out there with the IISAC, but we're looking forward to hosting. And again, we're on the Panhandle, so a lot of smaller counties out here. I'm the largest county in the Panhandle, good facilities to bring people in. And that way people don't have to travel. You know, Florida's a very large state from the outer reaches, Escambia or Monroe all the way to Orlando can be a 6 to 7 hour drive just to get into the center of the state.
So
Yes,
we've
this is the first year for that, Tina, that we did the same 5 classes, meaning the exact same content. South, which was Fort Myers, Central Orlando, that just wrapped last week. And then as Mark said, those same 5 classes are slated to go to Tallahassee. And in our original model, this was discussed. And as you can imagine, it's a bit more costly to do so because you're presenting the same thing with those same instructors, and those individuals have to travel. And we had a great deal of interest back in 2009. I think I'm saying that right. It may have been 2008. We had a great deal of interest from a couple of foundations who wanted to help support the program and be able to replicate it. And one of the things that we were asking for was the ability to do this regionally and the ability to do some online classes. And as you may recall, Bernard Madoff was arrested 2 days after I made the presentation to the association that we had this interest from foundations. One of the foundations had all of their funds managed by Bernard Madoff. So they had to shutter their door the next day. And so we never did receive grant funds, but that would have facilitated what Mark was talking about earlier, is our ability to have earlier on spread this out. And we just were not able to do so because the budget had to grow, and it has at such a point now that there's that sense that let's try this as a pilot program and see how it goes.
and Florida's a huge state, right?
Let me add something, if you don't mind, Tina. You know, and I personally didn't know that story till just right now. And obviously I'm looking armchair in hindsight. But I think that's the best thing that's happened right there, is this program is completely sustained and funded by the elections, by the professionals in here. And therefore, as unfortunate as it is across our industry, third-party funding is a major source of challenges. And so anytime there's a grant mechanism, unless it's a federal type grant or a state type grant, any third-party funding, unfortunately, in today's world, it's tough. And so my thought process on this is I'm happy that we self-funded. It was, you know, it was a little lean for a little bit, but it's certainly worked out for us through this process. You know, and startup costs, you know, a lot of our instructors, a good portion of them at least, are actually us. As I mentioned, I've done some, Mark's done some, we've done them all over. And so those costs, you know, having me come in and do a class, really there is no cost. It's an internal. I would, you know, give my time freely to do this and do, you know, to lower the cost. And so there are ways to build this, you know, at a good price point, you know, and maybe further down the line do some other things.
So we've kind of talked a lot about, you know, how this all came to be and the origination of it. I'd like to kind of hit a little bit on how it has benefited election officials and as well as your entire state, if you will. And I know that, Mark, when talking with you about really the state that we're in right now in our country, you specifically said the entire world is watching. So how does a program like this benefit election officials in your state, benefit your state, and even other associations across the country when it does feel like the entire world is watching us? What's the benefit here? And what have you seen within your own teams?
I think the benefits are frankly profound. With everybody watching, the stress levels are always high. The margin for error is extremely low. Even when you get it 100% right, people are accusing you of doing something inaccurately. So I think this, as Wesley said, it lifts all boats. It brings us all up to a very capable level. And it gives people, I think, within our association and our staff, the confidence that they do know what they're doing, and they can push back on some of this disinformation that's really running rampant lately. But I think it also has dividends other places. When we have to interact with the press, instead of it being an adversarial relationship, I think the press is getting to understand that we really know what we're talking about. And frankly, they don't. And it's a very complex, nuanced environment of statute, outside expectations, tight timeframes, deadlines, and the expectations of every voter. And for us to work confidently and competently within that framework, and it's ever changing. Every legislative session, there's new statutes coming about that. I mean, that's all we've been doing lately is meeting to try and incorporate that into our day-to-day activities. It's such a complex environment, surprisingly so, that this professionalized educational program we've developed over time, I think, just pays dividends from every direction. And even dealing with the legislature, instead of them just sometimes, and when we're lucky, we can interact with them ahead of time and really understand what they're trying to do and give them a better way to do it that really makes sense with all these the other election laws that are in the basis of the framework we work within.
Let me add to that as well. And Ann touched on this earlier. In each of these classes, we'll have like in-class activities where a group of 5 or 6 people that are in a little group all work together. So the other benefit that you hear constantly when you go to a conference or whatever else is a lot of the benefit of those are being able to interact with your people, meeting new people. And so by having these small groups all targeted on a particular subject, you learn through these classes who some other experts are in your field, and it's very Florida specific. You know, if we're talking tabulation, it's very Florida specific, and you get to meet all of those people that are doing, you know, at least have that same knowledge base that you do. So it's very imperative. You know, I think that's just another great benefit of it.
And that's one of the challenges.
One of the
good, man.
That has been one of the benefits, and we often just think of it as networking, but to make that networking be the most robust is we have to talk about best practices, or sometimes people call them better practices, meaning this is just a better way to do something. And then they have a face and not just maybe a name. And so they can, participants can call one another after the fact to say, oh, for voter outreach, that's a strategy that you've used. Tell me a little bit more about that. So they now have this whole, if you imagine this web of individuals who are working behind the scenes, which they've always done, but in a much more robust manner because they've seen that person, they've talked to that individual, and they've exchanged personal emails, phone numbers, and so on.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, much like what Ann was saying, that web, that's a good way to phrase it, really empowers all the elected officials. Just everything doesn't have to come through us to be implemented. We can get best practices being shared amongst our staff, and I think that greatly improves everyone's game. And that networking is, we talked about the Zoom aspect and going to a virtual platform. That's one of the things that we're always trying to guard against, is that we do recognize we lose a bit of that personal networking interactions that you only get from a face-to-face. So that's something we're always trying to balance.
No, and as a former deputy clerk and city clerk myself, I recognize the importance of those relationships, and especially given across the country, we've seen, a lot of turnover in our field. And so we have new election officials coming in, people doing the job for the first time or being promoted up to positions that they haven't served in before. And so those relationships are so critical, that networking. And I know that I had a group of friends that I would reach out to, fellow clerks in my state, and talk something through if we, especially in when it came to COVID, like, how are you going to handle this? How are you going to do that? What are you going to offer? And so it's just great, like you said, to have that. Not only do you feel supported, but it's somebody who talks your language, right? And somebody who understands what you're going through, and hopefully also is going to make you better and make you provide better services to your constituents. So I think that is as valuable as the classes. And I think that to not highlight that would be do it a disservice. So thank you for bringing that up. So as you look at this program, and I mean, for all of us looking at you now, we're like, you guys are awesome. You're total rock stars. This is amazing. But you started somewhere, right? And there were the early days when you were like, so if you had to set this program up all over again, because there are states in the country who are just raising up a program in their state, what would your advice to yourself be looking back?
I can mention a couple of things. I can mention a couple of things we've learned, and then can more adequately answer that question. But one thing that we did, because of the demand, 1 year we offered all 30 courses, meaning someone could have essentially been a completer and could graduate. However, there were some of these individuals who had never experienced a major election. So we made that change that for a person to actually graduate, meaning that you can use these letters behind your name, you have to have not only taken these 30 classes and of course passed the end of course quiz, but you had experienced a major election, because only then can you actually hang these things on pegs. Otherwise it's knowledge that's kind of out there, but it doesn't have as clear an application until you've seen it in action. And that was one of the pieces of feedback that we were getting after maybe 10 years, maybe it took about 10 years, but people saying, I see the big picture now. I really didn't know that's what so-and-so did. And so when it's all hands on deck, I know that if I've got to fill in and help that person, I know better what they do. So that's been a big learning for us, as what does it really take for a person to be fully certified, not just having sat through 30 classes. You have to experience what this looks like in real time. And I think if you were saying if we were starting this over, I really do believe we started it very well with lots of research. I think probably since I was conducting most of the research, I may have actually, instead of just 2 focus groups, I may have actually gone in person to talk to a few more people. We did that by phone calls, and I had 30 phone calls around the state as well as surveys, but maybe would have gone in person to have conducted some of those interviews, because you get to physically see things in offices. As we mentioned, we've got some very small counties. I think Lafayette County maybe has 1,500 people. I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong. So if I had seen that, it just would have increased my knowledge of how diverse the state was. Can anybody else think of something else we might have done differently at the beginning?
I think you touched on one of the items that I would make a big point of. I think when the classes were first coming around, and so we did a topic, the elections offices, the majority of them, not all, but the majority of them thought of, like if we did a class on HR, that was a class, they would send only the people that did HR to said class. It's more beneficial for everybody else that doesn't do HR to go to the class. The HR professional, if they've done that, a 4-hour class is probably not going to help them a lot. And so it's that rounding of the process that I think we needed to, you know, make a bigger deal of at the beginning of it, that we're raising all levels of this. We're not giving you a in-depth professional, you know, IT class here that you're going to be the systems administrator after this 4-hour class. That's not the focus. But you're able to talk to some of the terminology, phishing or any of the other stuff that we're doing. And I think I would make that more prevalent in our discussions with our association.
And I think for the smaller counties, especially that don't have a diverse staff or broad staff support, there's very few people handling all of these different aspects. And in the 30 classes, as Wesley pointed out, it's not just election stuff like tabulation or canvassing or what have you. It's HR and all the things that it takes to run an office, communication, leadership, all of those are types of courses we offer. And so it's really helpful to have everyone have that all across the board perspective, even whether it's staff or not. Now, certainly, if you've got a large staffing, you're just trying to ramp people in, and we're also trying to allow everybody to take part. Focusing on what your area of expertise is, especially if people are new, is key. One of the things you talked about, if we were starting over again, I think states that are looking at starting up now have an advantage of having more than just, you know, we primarily looked at CIRA, the election center stuff. And also, like, I'm an engineer, professional engineering associations and other industries where they have a professional approach. And I think that's what we recognized after 2000, we had to really adopt. But I think there's a lot more resources, like, you know, what we've learned from here in Florida. You can avoid some of our mistakes and you know, some of our less intuitive levers that really allowed us to move forward a little more quickly. You can do it now without stumbling over so much that we had to over the time.
Yeah, I think Wesley's comment was so on target. Thank you, Wesley. It kind of opened up my mind about that, of who do we expect is going to get the most for a particular topic. So it has to do with marketing and how that's presented in language that people would understand, as you can be a better team member if you do this as well, not just you're in charge of IT, you're in charge of HR. So thank you for that perspective. I really like that.
Yeah, the silos really is not a good approach.
Were there any particular tools or resources that you created or you found out there in getting this started that you could recommend to other organizations or associations that are looking at starting a program?
I have old notes. I've probably not thrown anything away, but I contacted probably 6 other states around the country. I had done a little bit of work with IACRIOT, with this is now IGO, and trying to find out who was doing anything at all similar. And that's something certainly I would recommend. And of course, your webinar is doing that for people who are tuned in, is find out who's doing something that's similar and talk to them, meaning, what did they find work? Were there any pitfalls? And as you said, what did we learn when we went through this? And also talk to professional associations. I talked to the property appraiser. I talked to people who were managing education. I talked to a professional engineering association. So probably 5 or 6 associations as well. And generally, to get certified, I found there was about 45 hours of classroom experience that would then indicate you probably would have a pretty good certification program, obviously depending upon your content, but that seemed to be a somewhat similar piece of data that I picked up.
I'd like to add one thing. You mentioned some lessons learned, and I know I had to make some tough calls. You know, one of the requirements of the class is that you actually participate in the class and are being present in the class the entire time. You know, and there have been some people that have attempted to push those boundaries. And we have denied, I can name a couple of names.
Don't.
Unfortunately, I think I was president when I had to do it, from people I know very well, that were logged into the class but I think we're off having breakfast or something else. And I'm sorry. And it's like, no, but you gotta state your rules, what your expectations are. And then the other thing, just as a parent, you do those things and then you stick by what you say. You know, if you say, yes, you got to be in the class for 3.5 hours, and I mean be in the class, not just logged in or you signed in and took a phone call for the next 2 hours outside. You got to stick with it. And sometimes it's an ugly call, but I think it's necessary for everybody else in that process. So beware of that.
That's some tough love right there.
I would say you can also, I think one of the things we've done also just leverage the university system here in the state. So for associations or groups of elections officials trying to ramp something up, you know, there's a lot of resources out there. And I think a lot of people would be very excited to try and help. So reach out and ask for help.
So Wesley, kind of going back to your comment a little bit, and we certainly, just curious without naming names. What kind of pushback did you get, when you were looking at putting this type of program in place? Were there people who were like, I don't need this, I don't want this? What was the pushback and how did you respond to that?
As we've stated several times, we are an extremely diverse state, not only in population, but suburb, urban, all of these very rural farm country, swamps, we've got everything but mountains. So we have the demographic that goes along with that. You get the person, and we face some of this from supervisors, a supervisor that has been in office for 25, 30 years. And, I've been there, done that. And, what else? But stuff that, and I don't think you're going to hit as much of that in today's world, just because so much stuff is changing on us all the time. And as an administrator, if I can make my team stronger, it takes more off of me as an administrator. And that's one of the self, my team's going to support us much better if we can do that. So we had, the pushback of, I've been doing this for 30 years. I don't need any outside person. Or you get to one that's like, well, I don't really care how they do it in Marion County. This is how we're going to do it in such and such. We get all of that as well. But I think once you get into the class, you recognize that a good 90% of it flows across the entire spectrum from the Lafayette counties to the Miami-Dades. And so there's something you can take out of these classes, every one. So like I said, there was a little bit of pushback, but now we've got participation, I believe, from every county in the state over the last, at least for this process. So I think everybody has at least somebody that's attended some of the classes now.
That's a good point. We'd have to check that, but yes, the popularity of the classes has certainly increased. I think another pushback that occurred to me when we began to plan this, there was also the comment is, we don't want this to be a sit and get, excuse my colloquialism, but meaning you had to do something. So certainly you had to participate, you had to stay in the class. We initially began that every class had an after class project, and the project dealt with that content. So for example, the one that I remember specifically was the class on budgeting for the elections office. And the after class project was go back and cost out, what does it cost to produce one ballot? Meaning, obviously you're producing hundreds or thousands of ballots, but that was the project. And there was pushback on that. Some of the projects took a little bit longer, and we've dropped that. So maybe a lesson learned is, let's make it as robust as we can when we're in the session and do as much as we can and make sure the application is strong, but don't give you a project because it was homework. And that was a lesson learned, if we might share that with the rest of those listening.
I had forgotten that, Ann, and you're right. No, I was not a fan of any
We
of the
hated that,
homework,
yes.
so-
It's hard enough to dedicate the time
Homework
to
to me
go.
was not a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't like it when I'm 16 and I wouldn't like it when I'm 50 either, so. So let's kind of, before we go into our Q&A here, so if you have some questions, you want to go ahead and add those out there. Let's end this on a positive note. We've talked about some of the struggles and the challenges that you've had. We've talked about some of the great benefits for the organization. So what's next? I mean, you're obviously continuing to grow and expand. You're getting national awards and national attention. So what's next for the program? Do you have any upcoming plans or projects?
I would say one of the biggest challenges we face is with the turnover. It's well known, the turnover in elections officials. And you talked about some of the hesitancy, or Wesley mentioned it about, I've been doing this for 25 years. I know it all. What am I going to gain? A lot of those folks are no longer in the business, with, I guess, Wesley and I are a few of the notable exceptions. But we're getting a big influx of people that also think elections are easy. They think they know it. They think they're going to come in and make dramatic changes because they've got their pressures of the constituency that was asking them to run. And suddenly they get in here and they're like deer in the headlights. So getting those people up to speed very quickly, because the demands are not going away, and we need to really make sure that everybody's up to speed. Just incorporating the ability to educate people quickly, so they're ready for their first election cycles, I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge. I think the interest levels there, certainly, and our introductory classes explain that, but that's going to be a challenge with the turnover.
That is crucial. And one thing that we did, Tina, was after sort of the 10-year mark, right around the 10-year mark, we did a full evaluation and put together a PowerPoint that looked at the high points, looked at what we'd learned, looked at what we were doing. And I think that's been a little bit of a tool. I think that was used at one of the conferences to be able to update some of the newer supervisors and their staff, so that it doesn't feel like you're being hit over the head. You do get a full orientation when you're a new supervisor, but nevertheless, for the program itself, to be able to market it and to say why this is beneficial.
And I think, both of the comments that Ann and Mark had made are a testament of why you need the certification program or the 30 classes all the time, because we do have I know one of our concerns when we started this is, what are we going to do when everybody gets certified and there's nothing left to do? Well, we just told you that we've got waiting lists to get into the brand new classes because the turnover is tremendous in our organization, unfortunately. And so I see a need for the first 30 classes for, forever virtually. And then going on, moving forward, I think Ann mentioned earlier that we do recertification classes, and we do those every couple of years. Ann mentioned that earlier today, she was actually working on our next recertification class, and we try to find relevant topics. We did a recertification class on redistricting a couple of years ago. Prior to that process, to give history, what we're going to move into, those type of things. So we're constantly doing those and adding those to our repertoire as we move forward.
So we've talked about a lot of stuff. I know we've got at least one question out there. So again, if you're watching and you want to add a question, please put that in the Q&A now. And while we're waiting for that, I would ask all of you, is there anything I missed? Is there something else you would like to add? Is there something that's come to your mind since we've been in this webinar and had this conversation that you are like, hey, this is one thing I forgot and I want to bring this up, that I want to offer you this time to do that?
I would real quick, I would just say, keep it current. And we talked a lot about how we do that, but we, as has been briefly touched on, we have a committee within our association whose sole purpose is to make sure that everything is current. Our courses incorporate the latest statutory changes and the demands from the outside world, whether it's audits or what have you, some of the changing aspects of our job, that need to be brought into the curriculum.
And do you have anything else to add?
I was just going to say that when we first started the pilot program that was held in Fort Myers at FGCU, we figured it out for what would be break even, because I think we were only charging $45 per class, and that included lunch, probably, and a little bit of a breakfast, that if we had 27 people, we could break even. And even for that first class, we had 45 people. So it was sort of, oh, we're on our way. And we made it past our break even point. So a little momentum early on was very nice.
Well, that's certainly appropriate for the first question that we have out in the Q&A. Is they are asking, what is the cost of what is the fee for the classes that you all charge, and what are your annual dues for your association?
We charge, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's $90 per class. And then annual association fees, which are not related to FCEP. FCEP is a total separate entity, but I pay an annual dues of 2% of the supervisor's annual salary. And our salaries are set by the state, so it's just a strict 2% of that. I think some of the other organizations across the state, Sheriff's Association, they may do 3 or 4% of the sheriff's salary. So ours are actually on the low end of dues in the state of Florida.
And so, and maybe this might be for you, and Wesley, you just said a good point that you're two separate entities. So can we make sure that we explain that a little better? I know we kind of talked about it, but how there's some separation there between the association and the FCEP. You were just talking about how there's some separation. Wesley?
Me? Oh, okay. I'm sorry I said Ann. There is some separation. We do have the president of the state association appoints an FCEP committee, and they oversee this, but the FCEP funded wise has its own separate bank account and travel and uses all of that, does all their expenditures and income all into that separate bank account that is separate from the state association. So we as an association don't deal with their funds, like I said, other than the startup cost, which the FCEP program paid back. From this point in time, it's a standalone, not really an organization, but it's a standalone entity that self-funds and takes care of all of its needs.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that explanation. I don't see any more questions out there, so I think you've all done a great job explaining this. And to wrap it up, I want to thank all of you who have tuned in today, and I feel confident that this webinar is also going to be watched outside of this live session that we have right now, because there's so much interest across the country. But I want to thank you as the panelists for joining us. I know that you're all very busy people. But what you are providing and the information you're giving right now is so critical in this time and space that we're in, with so much, again, interest. And as Mark said, with the entire world watching us, Florida has put together an amazing model for us to all look at and say, hey, how did you all do it? You came in under some very hot circumstances with a lot of criticism. And I can't even imagine what that would have looked like if we would have had Twitter and Facebook and all of those things operating in full force in 2000, how things could have turned out for Florida. But that's where we're all at now. And so we find ourselves in a space where we are wanting to create programs that look like what you have. And so thank you for the time and the effort in the last 20 years that your association has put into this, and the time that you've given to this. I want to mention that all the resources that have been mentioned here have been placed into chat. Any additional information as well as direct support can be found at www.electionsgroup.com. And I want to say thank you all again. Thanks for joining us. I hope you have a fabulous day, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.